Hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris White with the American Battlefield Trust, and I'm excited to be part of Lunch with Books. I want to thank Sean for having me back out. I've been to the Ohio County Public Library a number of times to speak in the past on a variety of different Civil War topics, but this is one that I haven't covered, and it really is going to be, I think, a cool topic. It's a lot of fun to talk about when you're out on the battlefield. It definitely was not going to be fun if you were a participant in 1862 during the Battle of Fredericksburg, talking about the street fighting during that December 1862 battle. And I'm going to start off by sharing my screen, show you a few things. And this talk is based off of a book that I co-authored with Kris Mikowski. Kris is, as we always say to one another, my life mate. Kris is a lot of fun and to work with. And we based this talk, or I'm basing this talk off of our book that came out in 2013. It was the flagship book for our emerging Civil War series called Simply Murder, The Battle of Fredericksburg. And since then, Kris and I have authored a number of different articles, and myself a number of different articles on Fredericksburg, a few different books. So we're basing it off of, or I'm basing this talk off of Simply Murder, The Battle of Fredericksburg. And, the organization that I represent is the American Battlefield Trust. Many of you may have known us as the Civil War Trust or the Civil War Preservation Trust or the Americans for Preservation of Civil War Sites. We've had way too many names over our 30-year history, but we are the American Battlefield Trust, and we preserve battlefields with deal with the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the American Civil War. And we've preserved land around Fredericksburg. You can learn more if you go to battlefields.org. You can learn more about the topic we're speaking on this afternoon, how the Confederate delaying actions worked at Fredericksburg. We have all kinds of different free articles, and we've also preserved over 200 acres of the land at Fredericksburg. So if you head down to a place called the Slaughter Pen Farm, we preserved 208 acres there in conjunction with the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust and a few other organizations. And it's really the only open attack plane left at Fredericksburg because the I-95 corridor came through this area and has really changed the nature of the battlefield down here. So that is my sales pitch. We hope you go over to battlefields.org, check out our organization. And as we move forward, let me jump over to the PowerPoint, which will get us started here. To talk about what we're up to today. So the Battle of Fredericksburg, as I mentioned, will take place in December of 1862. The battle itself, let's get my screen share going here. The battle itself, and I'm talking today about the river crossing and street fighting at Fredericksburg. And the battle took place in December of 1862, as I mentioned, and it'll be on the banks of the Rappahannock River. So that'll be the river we're talking about today. I'll show you some pictures of that river, modern and from the 1862-63 era, to give you an idea of where we are, why we came down here to Fredericksburg, and why the street fighting is an important aspect of the battle at Fredericksburg. And as we roll along here, what I want to show you is an artist's rendition of what some of the street fighting would look like. This is a painting by Don Troiani. Don Troiani did Fire on Caroline Street, and he's depicting the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. 20th Massachusetts Infantry is part of the Union's 2nd Army Corps. They have a little over 300 men that will fight at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And this is them marching down a street called Hawk Street, where you see the dry goods store over here. Let me pull up the laser pointer. The dry goods store over here, this will represent a street called Caroline Street. And this will be one of the main drags in Fredericksburg in 1862 and today. But this artist rendition of the 20th Massachusetts, also known as the Harvard Regiment, because they have a lot of Yale graduates. Just seeing if you're paying attention, there are a lot of Harvard graduates in here, known as the Harvard Regiment. These guys are going to cross the river at Fredericksburg. We'll talk a lot about them here throughout the session. And they will charge up Hawk Street. They'll go down Caroline Street, and they will burst like a shell inside of Fredericksburg. But you can get an idea of what Fredericksburg will look like during the battle. We have clapboard houses that we see over here with shattered windows, holes in the roofs. We have brick buildings. You can see an artillery shell up here in the upper right-hand corner that must have struck there. And then you'll see some other clapboard houses leading down to the river. The flags of the 20th Massachusetts are close to the Rappahannock River. We're only about 2 blocks into the city here where we are depicting the action here along Caroline Street. So this will give you an idea of artist rendition, a modern artist rendition of what some of the buildings will look like in Fredericksburg during the time, but also show you some paintings and photographs as we go along the way. So how do we get to Fredericksburg? Why do we get to Fredericksburg? Well, we have to back up to September of 1862. In September of 1862, the Union and Confederate armies fought at a battle called Antietam, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg. It'll be a Union victory. This picture that you're seeing here is of the sunken road at at Antietam. There's also a sunken road at Fredericksburg. But this sunken road, also known as the Bloody Lane, will see a lot of action throughout the late morning, early afternoon of September 17th of 1862, which turns into the single bloodiest day in American history. 23,110 Americans will be killed, wounded, or missing during the Battle of Antietam. Now, after the Battle of Antietam on September 22nd, just a few days later, Abraham Lincoln is going to issue his preliminary, what we call the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is a very controversial piece of legislation in its time period. It's even some controversial to some today. But the Emancipation Proclamation essentially frees all slaves that are in areas of rebellion in the United States, meaning that it is going to free all the slaves in the Southern Confederacy. So that is the idea behind this. Now, to give it some more backing and to give it some more oomph, what Lincoln is going to do is dispatch 3 armies into the South during the winter of 1862-63 because he plans to sign the Emancipation on January 1st of 1863. So to give it more of a backing, he wants to bring home as many federal victories as possible. So to do so, what he's going to do is he is going to push armies into the South. One army will go towards Vicksburg, one will go into Tennessee, and the army that will follow will go down into the Fredericksburg area. Just to make a long story short, it doesn't go well for Lincoln. The war effort around Vicksburg, Mississippi is going to be turned back until July of 1863 when that city finally surrenders. Then we will have a battle. Then we'll have a battle at Stones River, which is going to be a narrow Union victory, but that army can't do battle for the next 6 months. And then Fredericksburg will turn into what many consider to be a debacle. But prior to the battle, the midterm elections will take place. This will be on November 6th of 1862, and on November 6th of 1862, the Republicans don't do well. Like many midterm elections in the United States, the party who is in power do not do well in this midterm election. The next day, Abraham Lincoln, seeing the writing on the wall, is going to decide to relieve the commander of his principal army, known as the Army of the Potomac. The army will follow down to Fredericksburg, and that army is led by George McClellan, the guy that you see here. Little Mac is his nickname. McClellan thinks very highly of himself. He's a very competent general when it comes to building an army. When it comes to leading an army, he is woefully incompetent. So he will be relieved of command by his close friend, a guy named Ambrose Burnside. We'll show you Burnside here in a second. But from November 7th to November 10th, there's a big party up in the Army of the Potomac as George McClellan marches off of the battlefield and goes off into oblivion for a while and then comes back to run against Abraham Lincoln in 1864 in the election of 1864. So Ambrose Burnside is the gentleman that you see here with these awesome sideburns. That is where we get the sideburns from, Ambrose Burnside. And Ambrose Burnside is 38 years old at the time of the Battle of Fredericksburg. He will be the shortest tenured commander of the Army of the Potomac, a mere 77 days. Great guy to know. Not the best general on earth, but everybody who interacts with him seems to like him as a person. Now, he's appointed by Abraham Lincoln. And if you didn't know who Lincoln was in this picture, you don't pass go and don't collect $200. He is going to tell Burnside that he needs to bring home a victory before January 1st, before that Emancipation Proclamation is going to be signed. And Burnside is to work with this gentleman over here named Henry Halleck. his nickname, a derisive nickname, is Old Brains. Halleck is a big thinker and a backstabber, but he's not a big doer. And he is going to be described by Lincoln later on in the war as nothing more than a first-rate clerk. So that'll tell you all you need to know about him as a general. So Burnside, who now has command of 123,000 men, the largest army on this continent to date, he is going to look at a map of Virginia and he is going to spy this city. This is Fredericksburg, Virginia. He is going to notice a few things that he likes about Fredericksburg. In 1860, the census was going to tell us that there are 5,020 people living in the city of Fredericksburg itself. Half of them are Caucasian, the other half are African Americans, either free or enslaved. And these folks who live here on the banks of the Rappahannock River live in a very sleepy city, as many people would put it. The Prince of Wales would actually come over here in the 1850s and describe the town as one of those rare spots solely to be found so far as the North American continent is concerned, in the southern states and chiefly in Virginia, which has hardly had a building added to it for 50 years. It has long boasted itself as a possessing of a refined society, which may be interpreted as a society satisfied with the possession of moderate competency, unambitious, devoid of Yankee restlessness and greed. It is not a nice way of describing Fredericksburg, actually, and the people of Fredericksburg are offended by the way that they are pretty much shown as a backwater burg. So prior to the war, they're going to try to install new gas lighting, flowing water, improve their streets. And by 1862, one Union officer is going to describe the city as being an aristocratic and wealthy town. And there was more taste and comfort exhibited in their dwelling than any other place I had been in the South or in northern cities. The town was lighted with gas and well supplied with good water. The streets and sidewalks are in good order. The general location is superb, a valley about 2 miles wide, gradually rising up until you reach the first range of hills, then rolling off into beautiful and rolling country. So the valley he's talking about is a valley that you're looking at here. This is the Rappahannock River, and this is the Rappahannock River Valley. Fredericksburg, prior to the war, had a number of churches, a brand new city hall. It had 13 confectionaries, so that means they had a pretty big sweet tooth in the city. And they're also going to have a number of substantial hotels, and the river is going to bring trade up to this point where you see here. This is roughly the city docks in Fredericksburg. You can see a mill here along the banks of the Rappahannock. You can see the sluiceway running right here, the water coming out of it when they took this picture from the Stafford County, Virginia side, looking into the Spotsylvania County side of Virginia. The city is noted, has a number of steeples, number of churches. The church here, let me just pull up something a little bit better to show you. This church here is our Presbyterian church. Then we have our new-ish city hall, completed in 1858. Then we're going to have St. George's Episcopal Church. It's easy to find. It's on George Street. Then you'll have the Baptist Church down here. And all of these spires that you see that I've circled are all still there today in Fredericksburg. So if you stand over across the river from Fredericksburg at a place called Chatham Manor, which is the National Park Service headquarters in this area, you can see all of these spires sitting there today. Obviously, it'll be more of a modern cityscape, but there is still that 1860 feel to the city. The Rappahannock River, which runs right here in the foreground, is going to be the thoroughfare that will bring goods all the way up to Fredericksburg, which is the first navigable point, or last, depending on what ship you're on, of the Rappahannock River. It will flow in this direction towards the Chesapeake Bay, and their sister city of Baltimore would see many ships prior to the war coming in and out of the city of Fredericksburg, taking the goods between the two ports. The Piedmont, which is out in this direction here, we will bring your goods from the Piedmont down to the port, send them down to Chesapeake, and then up towards Baltimore. So that's how you're going to have a lot of trade here. There was a railroad here in 1862. This is actually where the railroad terminates because the Confederates had torn down the bridge that you can see right here across the Rappahannock River. It is known as the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, and the name of the railroad does exactly what it implies. It goes from Richmond up to Fredericksburg and terminates 15 miles north of where this picture is taken on the Potomac River near a place called Aquia Landing. So this is what Fredericksburg will look like at the time. Now, why does Burnside want to come here? Is it all the confectionaries? No. The reason he wants to come here is because Fredericksburg sits on our map here almost dead in the middle of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, at the bottom of our map, and Washington at the top right-hand corner of our map. So this is why we're going to come down through Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg was actually occupied by the Union Army from April till August of 1862. It'll be occupied a number of other times during the war. So since it sits between the two wartime capitals, Washington 50 miles to the north, Richmond 55 miles to the south, Fredericksburg obviously is going to become very important in the war cause. So what Burnside wants to do is he wants to move his army, and I'll show you a map here in a second, which is based up around Warrenton, Virginia at this time. He wants to move his army down towards Fredericksburg simply to seize the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad, which you can see here. He wants to use that as a supply base, and then or as a supply route. And then he wants to use two roads that'll run from Fredericksburg. The roads aren't shown on this map, both of them, but one, the I-95 of its day, known as the Bowling Green Road, the Richmond Highway, and a bunch of other names, will lead you down to Richmond. And another road known as a Telegraph Road will do the same thing. What Burnside wants to do is move his army to Fredericksburg, seize the city, use it essentially as a supply depot, supply his army using the railroad, and then you move his army on two parallel routes south towards Richmond. Because he has to win a battle before January 1st of 1863, what's the fastest way to draw a Confederate army out to do battle? That is, threaten its capital. Anytime you want to do battle in the American Civil War, threaten Washington or threaten Richmond. Politicians don't like being threatened, so they start crying wolf, and they will immediately call their armies out to defend them. And that is what happens time and time again throughout the American Civil War. Richmond, if he takes Richmond, that would be great. Most likely it will not end the war. Remember, the United States Capitol fell twice in our history, once during the Revolutionary War, once in the War of 1812, and we're still here. So taking Richmond might not necessarily end this war. So what Burnside wants to do is bring home a victory, interpose himself between Richmond and Lee's army, which is going to be stationed in Orange Courthouse area and up around the lower valley of the Shenandoah, force them to come down and do battle somewhere around Richmond or between Richmond and Fredericksburg. So that's the idea. And this will give you a nice idea of what Fredericksburg looked like just a few years prior to the war. We have the monument out here that you could see that's standing, which was not completed at the time. That is to Mary Washington. Mary Ball Washington will spend the last 17 years of her life in Fredericksburg. She is the mother of George Washington. George's sister will also live in Fredericksburg. She's going to live at a stately manor named Kenmore. George comes down to town a lot. He has friends here, Hugh Mercer, among others, who will serve in his army at Princeton and killed at Princeton in January of 1777. And then you can see the battlefield today. The main battlefield that most people know is the Marie's Heights sector, named after the Marie family home of Brompton that sits atop a series of 5 hills on the western side of the city. But what we'll focus on is action that will take place down here. And I'll show you some other maps that will bring everything to life. So what Burnside will end up doing is move down towards the city. He will shift his armies, as you can see here, which is his army, which is based around Warrenton, Virginia. There it is. He'll move from there down to Fredericksburg in about 2.5 days. It's going to rain, it's going to snow, but he is going to make a march to Fredericksburg, steal a march on Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's army, as you can see, is around Culpeper and up around Strasburg and Winchester in the valley. So it's spread out because they are playing to the tune of the Union Army. They don't know what they're going to do next. So Burnside decides he's going to move to Fredericksburg. Sees that railroad and those 2 roads that I told you about. Keep the campaign moving south. That's the plan. Robert E. Lee doesn't intend to fight at Fredericksburg either. He's so shaken by the fact that Burnside stole a march on him, he wants to defend Richmond closer, actually off this map, closer to the capital at a place called the North Anna River. But as the campaign plays out, General Burnside runs into his first major problem, and that'll be that he does not have bridges spanning the Rappahannock River. These bridges that we spanning the Rappahannock River were torn down by the Confederates. There were 3 of them there in 1862, and the Confederates tore these bridges down in April of 1862. Now, the Union Army, who occupied this area throughout the summer of 1862, know They already know that there are no bridges here. So before Burnside even moves his army, he is going to ask for temporary bridges to be shipped from Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is today West Virginia, down to Fredericksburg. And these are what the special bridges look like over here on the right-hand side. These are known as pontoons. Simply, they are boats, wooden boats, meant for buoyancy, not meant for speed. You'll take this boat, place it out in the water, turn it sideways, do the same thing with another few boats, and then put wood planking across the top. And that's how you'll make a ready-made bridge. You'll see me standing here by one of those bridges. This is me many moons ago as a National Park Service Ranger, standing beside a recreated pontoon bridge at Chatham Manor. Fredericksburg is across the river, and this is where the street fighting will take place over here. I'm on the far bank of the Rappahannock, where the Union Army will have to start off. And you can see a completed pontoon bridge behind me. And this is simply a wooden boat with wooden planks and wood decking across the top, roped down because you don't want to use nails in case an enemy takes your bridge. It takes far too long to pull those nails. You'll chop those ropes, let the bridge float away, and then you can fight another day and take your bridge apart downriver. So Burnside wants to have these bridges awaiting his army at Fredericksburg. That's the idea. So he tells Henry Halleck, old brains, that first-rate clerk, that I want these bridges there. Halleck says, no problem. Burnside's army arrives on the banks of the Rappahannock River, and the pontoon bridges don't arrive for the next 10 days. And in those 10 days, loving army bureaucracy as he was, Burnside is going to face a dilemma, and that is that the Confederates will start to arrive in force on the banks of the Rappahannock River. This is what a completed pontoon bridge will look like. This is actually taken just below the city of Fredericksburg. This is specialized troops known as engineers who have built these bridges out into the Rappahannock River. This bridge roughly spans 440 feet is what you're looking at. You'll notice the boats turn sideways. You have the wood planking put right atop of it. These engineers could construct this 440-foot bridge in roughly 2 to 3 hours if they're doing it under ideal conditions. These guys were good at what they did. To give you an idea, during the Chancellorsville campaign, which took place in April and May of 1863, they will put together and take down 34 different pontoon bridges, and they will do it in a very efficient manner. But they won't have that opportunity to do it here at Fredericksburg because of the Confederates. This is a little bit more close look at what the pontoon bridges will look like. You notice that every other boat is going to be anchored on one side and then anchored on the other. The Fredericksburg River, the Rappahannock River, is a tidal river. So these boats will go up, and these bridges will go up, they will go down. And the blur that you see here are some of the boats floating in the water, and they moved as this picture was taken because they have slow exposure time at the time of the battle. But these are the engineers who are proud of their work and who do a lot of great work. Specialized construction troops, there's only 3 units at Fredericksburg with the Union Army of these specialized construction troops. So they are definitely going to be very important to the Army. Now, when the Army is stuck at Fredericksburg, Burnside is going to look up and down the river, and he's going to decide for a variety of reasons that he cannot cross the river because of he's worried because winter's coming. We're in December of 1862 now. He's worried that if rains and snows come across the Rappahannock Valley, his guys will get stuck on one side of the river or the other. Now, he could ford the river. He could cross the river at low points, but he worried that if the river rose, that one part of his army would be stuck on one side with the enemy, the other stuck on the wrong side, and cannot support the guys on the other side with the enemy. And fortuitously, a few days later, it's going to rain, it's going to snow, and it's going to rise the river. If he goes downriver towards a place called Port Royal becomes famous in 1865. That's where the assassin John Wilkes Booth is cornered and killed down at the Garrett Farm. He's looking at a 1,000-foot wide river, much wider. At Fredericksburg, his bridges will be between 400 and 440 feet wide. So when you're over 1,000 feet wide down at Port Royal, it's going to be problematic, and he doesn't have his pontoon bridges yet, so he still can't cross the river. So he's going to sit on the north bank of the Rappahannock River. He's going to stare across, and as he does so, there will be some Confederates in the city, about 1,000 of them. And they'll start taking pot shots at at his army. And this is going to upset General Burnside. So he's going to send across on a rowboat. The man you see on your left-hand side, this is Marcina Patrick. He is the provost marshal of the Union Army. He is what we would consider the military police today. And Marcina Patrick is described as the greatest living fossil of the Cenozoic era. He has a great temper on him. He's a cranky old curmudgeon, thoroughly entertaining to read his writings. But Patrick is sent across in a boat to meet with the mayor of Fredericksburg, who's on the right-hand side. He's the aptly named Montgomery Slaughter. Slaughter is going to at first meet with Marcina Patrick and be very shaken, because Patrick is going to threaten to bombard the city of Fredericksburg. He's going to threaten all these things. Bunch of bluster, really. He can't back it up at this point. And Slaughter's shaken. He's going to go back to the city fathers and say that, we need to surrender the city to the Union forces. Well, a few hours later, after some meetings, the head of the Confederate Army will start to arrive in Fredericksburg. And whenever they arrive there, Slaughter gets a backbone. And he's going to go back to Patrick and pretty much tell him, no, we're not going to do what you say. Patrick, who's taken aback, is going to, threaten and bluster some more. And then a representative of the Union Army is taken into Fredericksburg, and he is going to be put in front of these Confederate officers who have arrived. And they now know the Confederates are here, and the jig is up. So threatening and blustering doesn't work. The two sides talk, and the two sides say, okay, we have a city between us now. The Confederates are on one side of the river, Union are on the other, and there's a city right in the middle of it. What do? We're not going to fight in this city. We're not going to bombard the city. These civilians, they have done nothing wrong. Let's let them be. So both sides agree that they will not use the city of Fredericksburg for military purposes, which is very important. They're going to go off on their separate ways. Burnside's going to try to figure out another way to get through to Richmond and bring home that victory for Lincoln before January 1st. And Robert E. Lee is going to know that his opponent is stuck on the far bank of the river. But what Lee does next is really going to be to the detriment of the city of Fredericksburg. Lee is going to dispatch about 1,800 Mississippi troops down into the city itself. These Confederates will go down into the riverfront. They will establish fortified lines. They will barricade the streets. They'll dig fortifications known as trenches. They'll go into the buildings, knock out windows, and prepare what we call a defense in depth. And I'll show you that here in a moment. So what Lee has done is immediately broken his promise to the Union Army and said that we won't use this for military purposes. Now he's placed 1,800 Confederates down into the city. They're under the command of the 41-year-old Tennessee native William Barksdale. Barksdale is not a native of Mississippi, but he moves there after taking up the law. Becomes a congressman prior to the American Civil War. He is a staunch states' rights defender. He is a Confederate through and through, plantation owner in the South. Barksdale is going to not be a West Point graduate. He is not a trained military man, but he has a good brain in his head, and he is going to use common sense to establish a defense in Fredericksburg. He'll establish his headquarters at a place called the Market House. This was the second town hall in Fredericksburg. Today it's the Fredericksburg Area Museum, and it was built in 1816. You can actually see this is where the market would take place. You can actually see the old meat hooks still hanging out here from the 1800s. So if you ever get the chance to go down to Fredericksburg, and I really suggest that you do. It's a beautiful city to go and visit. You can go into the Fredericksburg Area Museum, learn more about the city history, as well as this being the headquarters of William Barksdale. So what Barksdale will end up doing, he's going to set up what we call a defense in depth. It'll be a layered defense. His first defense will be right along the river, along a place called Sophia Street today. Sophia Street was also called Water Street at the time because it was close to the water. He'll set up a second line of defense along Caroline Street. That is the main thoroughfare through Fredericksburg. This is going to be today where most of the restaurants and shops are. And then he'll have a third line of defense along Princess Anne Street. His headquarters will be along Princess Anne Street in that building that I just showed you at the Market House. And what he will do is try to defend the city in depth. Once the first line falls, he can fall back to the second, then to the third, and then eventually they would head back towards the Confederate line at a place called Marie's Heights. So that is what Barksdale comes up with. Now you notice all the city streets. We call this Fredericksburg. This is named after the son of King George II, Frederick. He'll actually die in a freak accident playing tennis. But all of the city streets, or most of the city streets at the time, are named after the House of Hanover, which is the House of Hanover in Great Britain, because this city was founded in 1727. So this was when we were still British colonies, rather than the Commonwealth of Virginia at the time. So you have Princess Anne, Caroline Street, Hanover Street, William Street. These are all named after princes, princesses, and the king, because George Street's there too, of the House of Hanover. It is not named after Frederick the Great like a lot of people think. Now, if you're a civilian and you are in Fredericksburg, what are you going to do? You have a Union Army show up, you have a Confederate Army show up, you're going to get out of Dodge. And most of the inhabitants, the 5,000 or so inhabitants, are going to leave the city. And many of them will head to the west to a place called the Salem Church. The Salem Church is shown here on the left. It is a May of 1863 battlefield, but the Salem Church was founded in 1844. And on the right, you can see some civilians outside of the church. They will go and spend the next few weeks out in the December and sometimes into January weather, waiting to come back into their city. The Salem Church is still there today. It is not actively used by the congregation. The congregation actually is still active, but they built a new church in the 1950s and donated this church to the National Park Service at that time. This is a picture of some Union veterans out in front of the Salem Church. It's cool. It has multiple doors that you see here. One of the doors are for free Caucasians. The other door is for slaves to go in and enter the slave gallery, which is still there today. This was used as a hospital in 1863 during the Battle of Salem Church. And Mary Todd Lincoln, the first lady of the United States at the time, Abraham Lincoln's wife, her brother is actually a doctor here for the 3rd South Carolina Infantry fighting for the Confederacy in May of 1863. So the city is actually going to see a lot of the people evacuate. They're going to go out to the countryside. They're going to try to take refuge. But weeks pass. You know, we talked about this campaign started in mid-November. The battle doesn't take place till December 11th through the 13th. So now the civilians think that, oh man, maybe something's not going to happen. So many of the civilians will start coming back to the city. And our estimates are that there are at least 1,000 civilians in the city when the battle will start to take place in December of 1862. This is a picture taken along Sophia Street. This is a picture of a modern monument on the left-hand side of the 7th Michigan Infantry. We'll talk about them in a second. And then on the right-hand side is a large panel from Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. This is part of the National Park Service land. It's a sliver, but you can go down to the riverfront today and see where the engineers will lay their bridges. The bridges are laid by specialized construction troops. Call them engineers. Many of them are from New York, and there are some from the United States Regular Army. On the left-hand side, you'll see Wesley Brainerd. He is going to command the bridges that are going to be placed in the area we're going to talk about today, known as the Upper Crossing Site. There are 3 crossing sites. The military didn't overthink it. It's the upper, the middle, and the lower crossing sites. So at the upper crossing site, you have the guy on your left. That's Wesley Brainerd, New York native. It's a fantastic diary that he tells us about the Battle of Fredericksburg in. On the right-hand side is his commanding officer, a guy named Daniel Woodbury. Daniel Woodbury is going to be in command of all the engineers here at Fredericksburg. He, after the battle, is going to be punished, essentially. He's going to be the scapegoat, one of the scapegoats for the battle. He is going to be shipped off to Dry Tortuga, which is down in Key West. That will be basically him being sent off into Army exile after the battle. This is an artist rendition showing you what the engineers would look like working. So what the plan that Burnside comes up with is very simple. He thinks that he's going to look up the river and down the river, as we talked about. He now thinks that he is going to surprise the Confederates by moving across directly in their front and directly into the city itself. That is what he thinks. Essentially, he thinks that Robert E. Lee will not think that he is dumb enough to do this. Burnside is going to make basically the assertion that I'm going to cross the river right here in front of the enemy. No one will be dumb enough to do this, so the Confederates are going to be surprised. That's what he's pretty much going to tell President Lincoln. And Lincoln is going to say, all right, go for it. So with the president's backing, surprisingly, Burnside is going to decide to place 2 bridges at the upper crossing site where you see here, another bridge at a place called the middle crossing site. I'll show you that on the map. and then 2 more bridges about a mile south of the city itself at a place called the Bend, which is simply a bend in the river. So he will have 5, eventually 6 bridges going across the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg. The idea is on the morning of December the 11th, right around 2 o'clock in the morning, to start his engineers to the riverfront. It'll be a full moonlit night. They'll start to work on the river. They will construct their bridges by dawn. And throughout the morning of December the 11th, he will march across his army. And into the afternoon of the 11th, he will deploy them. And on the 12th, make an assault on the Confederate lines. Well, Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander, has other thoughts. Remember, he has 1,800 Mississippians down in the city. He's going to reinforce them with some Floridians. And at this point, he is going to contest the river crossing. And what will happen is that the engineers will start to move their bridges down to the riverfront and start to put their bridges in the water. Brainerd's going to tell us that we then rode out to the riverbank. All was quiet, peaceful, calm. Who would have dreamed that a terrible tragedy was soon to be enacted there? The moon shone with a quiet light which reflected from the sparkling snow which scarcely covered the ground. Little fires here and there on the opposite side of the river glimmered and sparkled from the ice which bordered the stream. On our side of the stream, everything was quiet, as if no enemy or army had ever existed. Spaulding, one of his subordinates, and I stood and gazed upon the scene for some minutes without exchanging a word. And what will happen around 2 o'clock in the morning, they will start to establish a bridgehead in the foreground here. They will establish the bridgehead here and start putting boats in the water. It'll be 24 degrees at this point. It's cold out, and there will be ice on the river. And the Confederates will start to hear the cracking of the ice on the river. But they don't immediately fire on the Union forces. The Union forces will get their bridges about halfway out into the river before the Confederates open fire upon them. Why do they do this? Simply put, they wanted the Union Army to commit. They didn't want to scare away their prey. So these bridges will start, like 2 fingers, start going out into the river, extending outward. As they extend outward at about 5 o'clock in the morning, a single cannon shot will fire, then another. And these cannon are not aimed at these Union troops. They're actually aimed at they're actually just signal guns to tell the Confederates to congregate at Fredericksburg because indeed Burnside is crossing here. About 15 minutes later, the Confederate infantry are going to start to fire upon them. And they're going to talk about, Brainerd will talk about, at about 5:15 in the morning, he said, I saw what for a moment almost chilled my blood. A long line of arms moving rapidly up and down was all I saw for a moment. Later, we're again obscured by fog. But I knew too well that the line of arms was ramming cartridges and that the crisis was near. I said a few encouraging words to my men, walked deliberately to the shore. Here I met General Woodbury and explained to him what I had seen. And what he is seeing are Confederates coming into position on the far riverbank. And at about 5:15, Barksdale orders them to fire. When they fire, there are 42 men on this bridge that you're looking at. Of those 42 men, 2 will be killed and 19 wounded within the first 10 minutes. The bridges will be abandoned by the engineers who run back to the far riverbank, and there they're gonna huddle for a while. The Confederates, after they've driven away the engineers, they stop firing. After those Confederates stop firing, out come the engineers a few minutes later. They start to build their bridge again. And this cat and mouse game goes on throughout the morning. So Burnside becomes infuriated as he's losing engineers left and right. This is an artist's rendition of these gentlemen working on the riverfront. So Burnside becomes infuriated. What's he going to do? He's going to place 147 cannon across from the city of Fredericksburg, and he's going to bombard the city itself. Remember, he and Lee had said we were not going to use this city for military purposes. Now that Lee's using it for military purposes, Burnside is now going to bombard the city. And on the left-hand side, his chief of artillery, Henry Hunt, will start ordering his men to fire. 1 round per cannon every 3 minutes will be fired into the city of Fredericksburg. He wants to make sure that the smoke will clear from the guns because we don't have smokeless gunpowder, so he can see their targets. He also doesn't want them to waste ammunition because remember, this costs about $2.62 to fire 1 round of ammunition. So he's watching the federal budget for all of us. So he doesn't want to waste ammunition or the taxpayers' money, and he is going to bombard the city. About 100 shells per minute on average over the next few hours will fall into the city of Fredericksburg. trying to dislodge the Confederates. One man described, when the artillery fairly opened, the roar was terrific, dreadful. I know of no words to express it. The screeching of the shells through the air and the whiz of the solid shot, the boom, boom, boom of the cannon, the sharp ringing of the rifles, and the rattle of musketry, all commingled, made one's ears tingle. It is going to be just a high density field of fire if you're in the Confederacy, or if you're a Confederate in this city. So as these shells come crashing in, the Union Army starts to realize they're having some problems, because they're going to bombard the city for a while. They'll stop, and they'll send the engineers out. As the engineers come back out, the Confederates will come out of the rubble and start firing upon them. Then the cannons will start firing like you see here again. Engineers will hunker down, Confederates will hunker down, and this cat and mouse game again goes on throughout the morning. We're having problems here. First off, the Union artillery really can't fire over top of the engineers effectively because their shells are bursting prematurely. These are the days before we have the shells that we know of today with full casings. At the time, we're using powder bags with iron balls, and it's as much an art as it is a science to be an artillerist. And it's getting cold during the day, warm during the day, cold at night, and this is really affecting the way that these shells are starting to burst. So sometimes the shells will burst right at the muzzle of the gun, right at the end of the gun, and that's known as rotten shot. Other times, they won't burst at all. Other times they're bursting prematurely over top of their men. So if you're a Union artillerist, you really don't know where or when your shell is going to land home and how effective it is going to be. So the Union Army is having a problem with their ammunition. Another problem was that down here in the city, the Confederates are not standing shoulder to shoulder like you normally think of in the American Civil War. That's known as linear tactics, Napoleonic tactics. These guys are broken up like modern sniper teams, 2 to 20 men in buildings, and they are inside of these buildings. So as one Union artillerist said, trying to kill a sharpshooter, trying to kill one man with a cannon was kind of like trying to kill a fly with a pistol, and it just didn't work. With these shells not always bursting, they're going to fire into those clapboard homes that I showed you in that the first slide with our 20th Massachusetts. These are clapboard homes. An impact shell hitting it at a high rate of speed actually will not trigger because the clapboards are too thin. So they're actually punching portals in the side of many of these homes, which Confederates can then use as ready-made holes to shoot out of. So this is really turning into a major problem for the Union Army. This artillery bombardment just isn't working. So we have another idea. Our idea is going to come from Henry Hunt, our chief of artillery. Hunt says, hey, we have boats, we have artillery. Why don't we put the two together, cross the river, and have our infantry establish a bridgehead on the far side? Our engineers can build while the infantry is fighting in the streets with these Confederates, and we can support them with artillery if we need to. Ambrose Burnside thinks it's a fabulous idea, and he immediately says, let's do it. Then all of a sudden he backs off. He's like, oh man, this might be a suicide mission. This is a forlorn hope. So he's going to ask for volunteers to go across. On the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a guy named Norman J. Hall. Hall's a West Point graduate of the class of 1859. And he is, as I'm going to put it, voluntold his men that they are going across the river. They are going to be the 7th Michigan Infantry along with a few other regiments. These guys are going to go down to the riverfront. They're going to pile into boats. These engineers are going to row them across the river. Everything's going to work well. We'll land across the river, and we will fight with the Confederates while our engineers finish the bridges, and we can march more troops into the city. Sounds easy. Henry Baxter is going to be in command of the 7th Michigan Infantry. He's the guy on your right-hand side. Baxter will actually be wounded early in the action. You know, most people think of the American military crossing the river. It's like crossing Washington crossing the Delaware. This is the famous Emanuel Leutze painting showing Washington crossing the Delaware, which is actually about the size of the Rhine River and has icebergs that will take down the Titanic. But you get the idea. This is what most people think of as the crossing of the river. So we have had riverine crossings. Washington will use them time and again throughout the American Revolution. He evacuates New York in 1776, assaults Trenton twice, once in 1776 and another time in 1777, using these riverine operations. But no one's ever done it in American military history under fire, meaning with someone shooting at you Washington, when he landed his forces, he always did it in secrecy. And this is what Geico always thinks of the look of the crossing of the Delaware. I think this is my favorite rendition of Washington crossing the Delaware, him trying to cross I-95, which you could probably do today with COVID being in effect. But what we're looking at is a 400-foot wide river. Our bridges would be out in this river on the right-hand side. They would roughly be about here, and they need to finish them. So what's going to happen is up at Chatham, this is a headquarters for the Union Army, and Edwin Sumner's headquarters. The 7th Michigan will come down a ravine over here. They'll jump into the boats, and they will come across the river and try to land right where you see their monument here today. So as the Michiganders, the Wolverines, run down to the riverfront, they'll jump into the boats. Out of the boats jump the engineers who have had enough of this nonsense, and they sit there and say, enjoy your voyage. The 7th Michigan will start to row themselves across the river. And it will be, if it wasn't so sad, it would be almost comical. But some of these guys are rowing faster than others. There are accounts of these guys actually spinning in the water because one side's rowing faster than the others. Some of the guys start to float downstream. Other men will be, because of the current, and they're not paddling hard enough. And then eventually you will have Henry Baxter, who's in charge of the 7th, be wounded in the chest. It looks like a mortal wound, and he's going to tell his second in command to turn back. But his second in command refuses to do so. He is going to order the men to keep going, keep rowing across the river, and eventually they will land on the bank of the Rappahannock River. Now, it's important to know that this picture is taken from the Confederate vantage point. The Confederates can only see out in about 2/3 of the river. You can see here. The rest of the river, they can't fire over top of this ledge where the monument and sign are placed today because the Michiganders are going to get in close, meaning that their field of fire for the Confederates are going to be completely constricted. So you can't fire from here. You can't see what you can't shoot what you can't see. So once they get about 2/3 of the way across the river, the Michiganders are okay. They land their boats and they are going to start jumping out, and they're going to push into the city. Now, this is not the first instance of street fighting that the United States Army has ever seen. Now, the Battle of Quebec in 1775 is really the first time the United States Army sees urban combat. Washington at Trenton will see it on 2 separate occasions. During the Mexican-American War, there's a few instances of urban combat. And then during the American Civil War out west in Kentucky, there are a few different battles that take place in cityscapes. So this isn't always the first time that you will see these types of actions. And of course, you have the Battle of Philippi Races, which isn't so much a battle, but the races there at Philippi that will take place in June of 1861. So we see some urban combat, but these troops aren't trained for it specifically like they are today in the United States military. I lead staff rides, which are military training exercises through Fredericksburg throughout the year. And we talk about this action, especially with the War on Terror, the battles in Fallujah and other places like that. I've had Marines, I've had the Air Force, the Army down here talking about the different actions that will take place. So they're looking back in 1862 to figure out what they need to do in the modern War on Terror. But regardless, the Michiganders jump out of the boats. They start piling into the first few houses. They're right up on the riverbank, and they start clearing them of Confederates. One Union soldier on the far side of the river said they could follow the fighting in the houses, muzzle shot by muzzle shot, room by room, because it got so bloody and so close in, because the Michiganders are just going to unleash a lot of fury on the Confederates. So as the Union troops go across, they're going to keep building the bridges, and as the fighting's taking place in the city, the bridges will be completed. And on this map, you can see will be the upper pontoon crossing site, and then towards the bottom here on the right-hand side, we have the middle pontoon crossing site. So we have 3 bridges here in the city being built simultaneously. And across the river at the same time as our Michiganders will go the 89th New York. They'll go in, they'll establish a bridgehead down here. These guys don't do a heck of a lot. They're going to establish the bridgehead and not go deep into the city. But the Michiganders and other troops will start to do so up in the upper crossing here. So what will end up happening is the 7th Michigan comes in. They'll be reinforced by some Bay Staters from the 19th Massachusetts, and they will secure the bridgehead. Now, remember, they're making this up as they go. Another unit will come across, and that'll be the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. 20th Massachusetts Infantry will come across they're supposed to come across the bridges, which are completed by now, but for panache, they jump in the boats and float themselves across the river, even though they didn't need to. These guys will come up into this bridgehead, which you can see is just filling with Union soldiers. So now we have thousands of Union soldiers who have breached that first line of defense and now are breaching the second line of defense up in this sector for the Confederates. And things are starting to look poorly for the Confederates. But at this point, it's about 3:30 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They have bought an entire day for Robert E. Lee's army. Their job is done. They had two jobs. One, to tell Robert E. Lee that the Union Army is crossing here. Number two, the other job, that was to delay the Union Army as long as possible. They have done both their jobs, and they've done it extraordinarily well. So the Harvard Regiment, when they come across, on the left-hand side is George Macy. He's commanding the Harvard Regiment here at Fredericksburg. On the right is a man named Henry Abbott. Abbott is a company commander the lead company commander here in Fredericksburg for the 20th Massachusetts. When they come across the river, they are going to reach a point on Hawk Street, which is right about here, and where they find the 7th Michigan Infantry. It's commanded by Thomas Hunt. Hunt has hunkered his men down behind a low wall, and he is content. He has established the bridgehead like he's supposed to. Up from the bridgehead marches the 20th Massachusetts. And right about halfway down Hawk Street, Hunt and Macy start arguing with one another on who is going to go into the next intersection, which is right here. That's the Caroline Street, Hawk Street intersection. It's the deadliest intersection in Fredericksburg after this. And the Confederates are there. They're within 50 yards, if that, of the Union forces. And Hunt is going to say, I'm here. I've done what I'm supposed to do. Macy's going to tell Hunt, go forward with your regiment. We'll support you. Hunt says no. Macy, again, says, go forward. We'll support you. He send word back across the river for more information from their superiors. All their superiors say is press forward. Doesn't do them any good. So Macy, who is stubborn as the day is long, is going to turn to Hunt and tell him that he is going to take his men into that intersection where no living creature can make it as he's told. He's going to tell Thomas Hunt in front of all these Confederates who can hear what's going on that he can take his regiment and he can go to hell. So the 20th Massachusetts, like you saw in our first painting, will charge into this intersection. And Henry Abbott will keep charging with his company, and turn this way deep into the heart of Fredericksburg, where right about here, he is going to run into a portion of the 17th Mississippi Infantry, ironically commanded by his old Harvard roommate, a guy named Lane Bryant. And Bryant and Abbott will face off against one another. It's one of these brothers against brothers episodes. And Bryant knew that Abbott was in his front and refused to retreat in the face of his old roommate. He actually will eventually give up his position later on that afternoon after he is ordered out of there twice and threatened with a court-martial. Bryant will finally give up the fight. The Massachusetts boys will then also go up Caroline Street in two different ways. But as they enter this intersection of Caroline Street, men will be falling by droves. Scores of men will fall. Because Confederates are going to have an advantage. They're going to be in the buildings that are adjacent to this intersection. And they'll be in the second and third floors. They actually have the high ground. They'll be firing down into these Bay Staters. But when the Bay Staters fire back, even if they don't hit their target, the bullets are so large that they're going to rip through these clapboard homes and carry in glass, nails, and bits of wood, shrapnel as it were, and wound the Confederates. And the Confederates said that the wounding from the shrapnel, this improvised shrapnel, was worse than the bullets coming from the Union soldiers. Eventually, this section of the city will be secured by the Union forces, and the Confederates will pull out. At the middle crossing, down at George Washington's Ferry Farm, this is one of his boyhood homes, which was across the far bank of the Rappahannock. You can actually go there today and visit the old site. His family ran a ferry here. That's why it's called Ferry Farm. The 89th New York will cross. They will come into an area of the city wharves. And like I said earlier, they will just essentially sit here and stare off against the 21st and 18th Mississippi Infantry. Up in the northern end of town, you can see the Union forces who have breached the city. Here's our friend Abbott, as well as some more Floridians. And this bridgehead will start to expand as more and more Union soldiers start coming down into the center of Fredericksburg. Barksdale's defense in depth has done its job. In near darkness, he is going to start to pull his men out of the city and back to Maurice Heights. Now, Burnside's timetable is completely thrown off. He wanted to march across on the 11th, make assaults on the 12th. Now he's going to have to march across on the 12th and make assaults on the 13th. This is, in this section, this is actually the old Rocky Lane. This is the old lane, the oldest road in Fredericksburg. And this is the road that you would take to get down to Washington's Ferry Farm. It's also the same road. It's been refurbished by Historic Fredericksburg Foundation a few years back, where the Union Army will march up. The famed Iron Brigade will actually march up the street to go into the city of Fredericksburg on December the 12th. Now, on December the evening of December the 11th, the Union Army has been very upset. They had been within 8 miles of the city of Richmond, the Confederate capital, in 1862, and then everything turned on its ear with Robert E. Lee taking over the Army of Northern Virginia. They were pushed all the way back to their own capital at Washington. They had seen their friends here at Fredericksburg be mauled by the Confederates as they rode across the river, because it was the greatest panoramic view you could imagine in the American Civil War. So the men will start to take out their frustration on Fredericksburg, and they will sack the city. Men will go into the streets, as you can see here on the right-hand side. They will go into the streets, and where they will start to take anything that they want back across the river. Stuffed alligators, women's dresses, books, anything you could think of. And the city itself is going to burn because of the artillery bombardment. Actually, Union soldiers will try to put it out from Philadelphia. There were some old firefighters who were firefighters prior to the war, come into the city and go to their trade to help try to put the fires out in Fredericksburg. But one story sticks out as we start to close here, and that is the story of Alfred Sully, who's here on the left-hand side. Sully is the son of Thomas Sully, who was an artist from Philadelphia. Alfred, who you see pictured here, went to West Point, graduated in 1841, and was commanding a brigade of infantry who were in the city of Fredericksburg in 1862 here. He marched his men across on December the 11th and went into a stately house with a few of his soldiers. And there's soldiers pillaging everywhere. But as Sully goes into this house, they walk into a beautiful parlor, and they see paintings all over this parlor. And in one of the paintings was a young child. And one of the men said something about the painting to Sully, and Sully said, "Well, that is me." And it was actually a painting by his father. In fact, this entire parlor was painted by his father because this was his sister's home. And this was where they lived here in Fredericksburg. So Sully will establish his headquarters in his sister's home, protect it, and protect those paintings of his father. So not everything will be ransacked in Fredericksburg. But the bombardment and looting of Fredericksburg will take a toll on the city. There are 2 battles that took place here in Fredericksburg, and both of them will take a toll on the city. This is on Lower Caroline Street, as it's called. These are beautiful homes today. They still stand today. And these homes down here, as you can see in this photograph from the period, you can see the holes in them, glass shattered out. And this is going to be where the fighting took place down at the Middle River crossing. Also, the concussions of the artillery shells going off will shatter a lot of this thin glass and produce these holes here in the homes. This is a place called Liberty Town. This is the very edge of Fredericksburg. Now, the Union Army will bombard the city. And if you go to Fredericksburg today and you drive down the main street, you will see that there are a lot of 1940s, 50s, 60s places that have been built, or buildings that have been built. That is the area where the bombardment took place. Fredericksburg does not economically recover from this war until about the 1950s. It doesn't get its wartime population back until that time as well. So as you're driving along in the upper side or the north or south side of the city, you'll see these historic Revolutionary War era homes. But then you get into the center of the city, you'll see these buildings that are from the 40s and 50s. And that is where most of the fires would have taken place, and that's also where a lot of the bombardment was focused. Now, this area, Liberty Town, this is the freed African-American section of the town. This side was not bombarded by the Union forces. This is actually bombarded by the Confederate forces, because this is where Hanover Street will come out of the city towards Maurice Heights, and the Confederates will zero in on this section of Fredericksburg, bombarding the Union troops as they go into battle. The Union Army bombarded about 2/3 of the city, while the Confederates will bombard about 1/3 of the city throughout the battle. That'll take place on December 13th of 1862. So not all the damage done here was done by the Union forces, but by no means the Confederates did not do half as much damage as the Union Army will do to Fredericksburg. After the battle, there will be a concerted effort in the North where they will try to put together a relief effort, as well as in the South, and send about $250,000 to Fredericksburg to help rebuild. But the cost here at Fredericksburg will be will cost Burnside dearly. 2 days later, he will make his assaults at Maurice Heights and at a place called Prospect Hill, where his men will be met with grievous losses. 13,000 Union soldiers will be killed, wounded, or missing, and about 5,000 Confederates. It's a very, very lopsided battle here at Fredericksburg for another time. But Burnside, the delay that Burnside put or was inflicted by Barksdale will slow him down and give Lee time to really fortify his lines here at Fredericksburg and bring home a victory. The casualties that took place on December the 11th between the Union and Confederate forces, it's about 242 Confederates will be killed, wounded, or missing on December the 11th. About 330 Union soldiers will be killed, wounded, or missing in the street fighting. That's over about a 4-hour period. To put that into perspective, during the Second Battle of Fallujah and the War on Terror in November and December of 2004, the United States military lost 655 men killed or wounded over a 6-week period. In less than 6 hours, the Union and Confederate armies almost met that same number because of the tactics used here that the two sides really don't understand, and they're coming up with on the fly. And that's one of the reasons that our military comes down to Fredericksburg year in and year out to learn a little bit more about the Battle of Fredericksburg. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share. And sorry, folks, I could see that you were asking questions, but I can only see my PowerPoint. So if you have any questions along the way, I'm sorry, I'm going to try to answer them here. Thanks, everybody, for the compliments. I hope that the PowerPoint worked for you, because I see some people it worked and some people it didn't. But I don't see any questions here for you. I'll give you another second or two. And I want to thank you for watching today. And as I said, I'm part of the American Battlefield Trust. We do preserve battlefields down at Fredericksburg. What we do is we pretty much preserve battlefields with the American Revolution, War of 1812, and the American Civil War. And then we turn them over to the National Park Service, or we create a park out of them. So that's what we try to do is build parks and tell stories, and that's kind of what we do here. So with that, I'm going to let you all have the rest of your day, because it doesn't look like you have any questions. And thank you, folks, for being a part of this.